dictates that the greatest hero can only ever be as great as his most fearsome villain. For Batman, the Joker. For Daredevil, Mark Waid. And of course, for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, their arch nemesis, the Shredder. What many comic fans don't realize is that for the first several years of the Turtles' existence, they had no clear antagonist. They killed the shit out of the Shredder in literally the first issue. He was Elvis dead. Turn-based RPG dead, with zero ambiguity on the subject. It wasn't until a mysterious figure reformed the Foot in 1988's Return of the Shredder storyline that the Turtles at last located the yin to their yang. To anyone who's seen the 1990 TMNT film, which still for me ranks among the all-time great comic book adaptations on the silver screen, the story will seem very familiar indeed. In fact, reading this comic, you'll even note exact panels from the comic reproduced in faithful detail on the screen in Steve Barron's film adaptation. From Casey Jones' introduction to the establishment of the Foot as a clear and legitimate threat, this was Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird at the absolute height of their creative powers. For the first time in the life of their creator-owned series, not only elevating the TMNT above their humble origins as a tribute to Frank Miller's Daredevil, but filling out the world of the Turtles with a ground-level lore that is largely adhered to this very day. That, and it doesn't get much more badass than this full-page, 3-page, fold-out splash to reveal the new incarnation of the Shredder for the very first time. Be still my beating boner. Return of the Shredder? Read that shit. Next. Brian Michael Bendis and Alex Maleev may well be my favorite Daredevil creative team of all time, and in my opinion, the controversial and plot hole-ridden masterpiece, The Murdoch Papers, was the perfect bookend to an exceptional run. So Daredevil finally puts the Kingpin away, and thanks to declaring himself the new Kingpin of Hell's Kitchen, long fucking story on that one, folks, he manages to secure a lengthy, albeit fragile piece for Hell's Kitchen. The Kingpin claims he has the complete file on Matt Murdoch, the Vigilante. A complete catalog of his origin, his motivations, basically irrefutable proof that Matt Murdoch is Daredevil. He calls them, you guessed it, the Murdoch Papers, and he's willing to talk trade with the FBI if they let him go. See, the FBI already has the Kingpin, and if they let him loose as an established crime boss, I guess they figure they'll still have like 1,000 reasons to put him back behind bars. So it's Daredevil they want. They're only going to get one shot at him. His secret identity was outed in the tabloids earlier in the run, but he fired right back using the Barack Obama method, deny, deny, deny. What follows is basically just a masterfully written, modern film noir with the Kingpin showing his unrivaled manipulative acumen as he plays all sides against the middle. It really is the ultimate Kingpin story. And let me tell you, there are more sides to this than a fucking disco ball. Everyone catches wind of the Murdoch Papers. The Hand, Bullseye, the Black Widow, and even a long-believed deceased young lady by the name of Elektra you may have heard of. It erupts into a full-scale war on the rooftops of Hell's Kitchen and ends with one of the most excruciating cliffhanger endings I've ever fallen victim to. Now, admittedly, you're going to get a hell of a lot more out of this graphic novel if you go back and read from the very beginning of Brian Michael Bendis and Alex Maleev's Daredevil run, a storyline called Out. But as a climax to a very well-penned and consistently exceptional run, the Murdoch Papers are without fucking peer, the polar opposite of Mark Waid's pseudo-retro hipster pretense in the more recent Daredevil offerings, or Carl Kessel's soon-to-be abortion that'll be launching I think it's launching this month, actually. Whereas Mark Waid's Daredevil Volume 3 is aged like milk, Bendis' take on The Man Without Fear is aged like Cindy Crawford. Emphatically recommended. You know, without Superman, the very concept of the modern superhero would not exist. That is a big deal. One publication essentially responsible for the creation of an entire subgenre of science fiction. But lightning struck again in the year 1975 and would later be reprinted within the pages of a very different kind of comic book emanating from France. You call it comic, they call it bande dessinée, whatever the nomenclature. What is certain is that without this comic, cyberpunk as a visual and literary concept very well may not exist. That comic's name was Metal Hurlant, known stateside as Heavy Metal Magazine, and that graphic novel's name was The Long Tomorrow. Long before William Gibson coined and championed the term in his Neuromancer novel from 1984, The Long Tomorrow embodied every solitary tenet that comprises cyberpunk, and even threw in a bit of film noir for good measure. Written by Dan O'Bannon, whose name should sound familiar if you've seen a little movie he wrote by the name of Fucking Alien, with breathtaking illustrations by the late artistic demigod known as Mobius. Weighing in at a mere 17 pages to even call it a graphic novel is a bit of a stretch, but in the gestative years of the fledgling format, The Long Tomorrow nevertheless fit the bill. And I'm not the only person whose mind was blown clean off his goddamn shoulder blades when he read this for the first time. In the mid-70s, a rising Hollywood director by the name of Ridley Scott felt much the same way. It not only convinced him to hire Dan O'Bannon to pen the Alien script, it also inspired him visually and tonally into ultimately crafting the cyberpunk watershed, my favorite film of all time, Blade Runner. Without this graphic novel, there is no Alien, there is no Blade Runner, and thanks to causing a massive stir on an East Asian island chain that shall remain nameless, you can thank Metal Lawn and the 1981 animated film it ultimately inspired for changing the aesthetic, violence, and level of mature content in both manga and anime. Before The Long Tomorrow, manga and anime was Robotech, and Astro Boy, and Speed Racer. After it, it was Akira, and Bubblegum Crisis, and Ghost in the Shell. That's a fairly radical stylistic shift, and it's staggering just how few people ever actually discuss the profound influence of French comics on Japanese entertainment. Without it, the entire face of late 70s, 80s, 90s, and even modern manga and anime, like a post-2000 Nikki Cox, would be completely unrecognizable. It's a Napoleonically short read, but I cannot recommend it highly enough. You know, for everyone who reads comics from my generation, I think everyone has that book. You know, the comic or graphic novel that, although they'd long since fallen out of love with comics, somehow single-handedly seized them from the mire of their own adolescent indifference and once again planted their feet firmly on the path of comic fandom. For some, it's Neil Gaiman's The Sandman. For others, it was Jim Lee and Jeff Loeb's early 2000s Hush storyline in Batman. And for others still, it was Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely's new X-Men revamp around the same time. There's no wrong answer on this one. What set me apart, I suppose, is that when I re-entered comics in 2002, I still had no interest in superheroes at the time. I'd soured on the genre in the 90s, and I wasn't about to come crawling back to the Long Underwear Brigade. What I was looking for, thanks to my lifelong love of the Oz books, the Brian Jacques Redwall series, and of course the recent release of a little film franchise you may have heard of called Lord of the fucking Rings, was fantasy. All right? Not Dark Horse's Conan, not Dynamite's Red Sonja. I mean the real shit. A proper, brand new world of fantasy without genre cliches like elves, dwarves, or orcs, but created solely for the comic book medium, taken seriously with the lush illustrations the genre invariably demands. And then I found Sojourn. Simultaneously exploiting and inverting all of the established fantasy tropes in contemporary fiction, Sojourn stands worlds apart from literally any fantasy story I've ever encountered, in comics or in print, of the last 15 years easily. Main character's a scorching hot blonde chick. Main supporting character's a thiefy male ne'er-do-well with bulging pecs and a heart of gold. Well, these two will be fucking in the first 5 panels. Nope. Never happens. Because Arwen is treated, and yes, that is a tribute to Tolkien, but Arwen is treated as a 3-dimensional female character. Her husband and daughter were murdered in front of her eyes. The very fact that she's on a revenge quest proves she hasn't emotionally moved on. You think she's gonna hop on the first dick she sees? Okay, maybe if she's a bad ex-girlfriend, but fuck no! She's bitter, she's vengeful, she's in extraordinary emotional denial, and don't tell Anita Sarkeesian, but she's actually fucking flawed. Possibly the most controversial artist of modern comics, a man by the name of Greg Land, does the illustration. Why controversial? Well, chiefly because nerds don't realize there's a difference between lightboxing poses because you're going for photorealism on a fucking deadline and tracing your fucking comics outright. They also want to crouch behind a wafer-thin double standard as far as I'm concerned, because nearly all these morons who hate lightboxing nevertheless love the work of Adam Hughes, who has unequivocally admitted to, in an issue of Wizard, which I physically fucking own, to tracing Playboy models in the past. In my opinion, Sojourn is still the high watermark of Greg Land's career, and Hughes fanboys can choke on my Lightbox cock. He stagnated a bit at Marvel because it's easy to stagnate while you're drawing superheroes, but on Sojourn, the subject matter is eternally transient. It's a journey, alright? You're trekking through the snow-capped mountains of Skarenheim or the arid deserts of Ankara. It just never gets old. If there's one comic company I would love to resurrect, fuck the Valiant relaunch. Fuck Malibu Comics. Make mine fucking CrossGen. Without CrossGen Comics, the industry would not be what it is today. They set the new standard with, high-gloss magazine paper. They made listing creator credits on the front cover an actual industry standard, while DC and Marvel were still fairly half-hearted and inconsistent about it. Hell, even the page one narrative summary at the beginning of most modern comics was one of CrossGen's innovations. Combine that with the fact that they discovered some of the biggest artists in the field today, from Civil War's Steve McNiven to Josh Middleton, and even helped revive George Perez during a period when that god-made flesh was seriously considering never drawing a comic book again. And get this, they published not one superhero title, but they sure as shit did everything else. Spy fiction, sci-fi, high fantasy, low fantasy, feudal Japanese drama, historical fiction. CrossGen Comics was the fucking shit. Marvel now owns the rights to their properties, but apart from the odd testing of the waters, they've done fucking all with it. Meridian, Batazad, look, they're great comics for children, and Meridian would make a fantastic animated children's film. But Sojourn? I mean, Sojourn was in the top fucking 20 in the sales charts. Consistently. A fuck of a lot higher than Mark Waid's Daredevil is right now, that's for fucking sure. And no, I won't drop that fucking subject. And yet we didn't even get a fucking ending to Sojourn. Marvel Comics, resurrect this book or eat desiccated Mordath dick. Next. Daredevil is not Marvel's Batman. The modern incarnation of Batman, however, owes an awful lot to 80s Daredevil, and that is a fact. Yes, we all know Batman predates Daredevil, thank you, Prince of Pedantry, but the simple fact is, when Frank Miller, Klaus Janson, Denny O'Neil, and David Mazzucchelli gradually turned Daredevil from a B-grade Spider-Man to the first modern exploration of the pulp noir superhero and promptly leapfrogged The Dark Knight to the very top of the sales charts in the 80s, DC Comics sat up and took notice, and then they started stealing shit. Needless to say, Frank Miller Daredevil caused a stir, and the entire industry took heed. And the apex of the Frank Miller regime at both Marvel and DC is unquestionably Daredevil Born Again. The story? Very simple. Daredevil's longtime flame Karen Page left him years ago to become a star in Hollywood, but like many aspiring actresses, she finds herself more often working a director's button fly than working reporters on the red carpet. She develops a taste for heroin. She trips and falls into porn. To feed her illicit habits, she begins seeing a small-time South American drug lord. At the end of her rope, to pay for just one more fix, she lays down the one trump card she has. She tells the drug lord that Matt Murdoch is Daredevil, and the drug lord, in an effort to ingratiate himself with his betters and improve his station in the criminal underworld, promptly informs the Kingpin. This was earth-shattering stuff in the 1980s, and even now. Karen Page was an all-American girl prior to that, the Lois Lane to Daredevil's Clark Kent. Marvel's Lois Lane got hooked on H and sold Superman out to Lex Luthor. Frank Miller has balls the size of a fucking planetoid. Needless to say, over the length of the graphic novel, Matt Murdock is put through the proverbial ringer, and for much of the story, he doesn't go anywhere fucking near his actual Daredevil costume, which is downright fucking incredible. I won't divulge the full story because it's a ride that must be experienced to be appreciated, but I will say that this was Miller's creative peak. It's better than literally any Batman story he ever told, because Marvel didn't keep its creators on nearly as tight a creative leash as DC does. Frank Miller hadn't yet disintegrated into the caricature of himself that he is today, and David Mazzucchelli, simply put, cranks out the finest artwork of his entire fucking career. I understand and even echo the accolades afforded Mr. Mazzucchelli for his incredible work on Batman Year One. But his artwork on Born Again just fucking demolishes it. The line work is thinner, making the detail much sharper and the illustrations more precise. On Batman Year One, I don't know if he went with like a brush for inking or what the fuck, but the lines were just like thicker, the figures were more fuzzy and indistinct. You can sort of see what I'm talking about here. There's just a more cartoony, less realistic edge to his Batman art, the polar opposite of the more photorealistic approach of his work on Daredevil, which you can see right here. It's invariably featured in the top 10, if not top 5, of every greatest graphic novels of all time list that's ever existed. But unlike overrated, pretentious tripe like The Watchmen and The Killing Joke, this is one graphic novel that well exceeds expectations. I'm RazörFist. Hope you enjoyed the list. God fucking speed!